On Thursday morning, my subway card flashed a harsh red over a $3 fare. I called my son, who nonchalantly chuckled over the phone. "Your memory's been slipping lately, Dad. I put a hold on your card. From now on, just text us if you need to buy something." My daughter-in-law instantly cut in her voice, firm and final. "To be clear, you need our permission for even a single dollar. No exceptions." I quietly walked to my car, hit the gas, and drove straight to my lawyer's office. The next morning, 55 missed calls flooding my screen. "I'm so thankful to have you here at Dad's Revenge Stories. What city or country are you watching from? Let me know in the comments." Some fictional details were added to this story for entertainment and educational purposes. Resemblance to actual persons or locations is coincidental, though the core takeaway is very useful. The turnstile beeped twice. I swiped my Metro card again, slower this time, the way the transit worker once showed me years ago. Steady pull, not too fast. The reader flashed red. "Insufficient fare. Please add value or use another card." It was 8:47 on a Thursday morning in October. The 86th Street station on the Upper East Side smelled the way it always did. Iron rails, damp concrete, and the particular staleness of air that never quite reaches the surface. Commuters pushed past me on both sides, a river of wool coats and coffee cups, and somewhere behind me a kid with earbuds so loud I could hear the bass from 3 feet away. Ordinary Thursday. Ordinary New York, except my card had $40 on it when I checked it Sunday night. I stepped aside, let a young woman in scrubs hurry through, and pulled out my phone. Derek answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad." His voice was easy, relaxed, the voice of a man who'd already had his coffee and wasn't in any particular hurry about anything. "Something's wrong with my Metro card," I said. "I'm at 86th Street. The fare reader won't take it." A pause. Not the pause of someone confused, the pause of someone deciding how to say something they've already prepared. "Yeah, about that." He cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to talk to you. I put a hold on the card, Dad. Just temporarily." I didn't say anything. I let him keep going. "It's just Sandra and I have been noticing some things lately, little things. You mentioned you couldn't remember paying your Con Edison bill last month. You left your keys in the door twice." Another throat clear. "We're worried your memory isn't what it used to be. The card hold is just to make sure you're not, spending on things you don't remember spending on." 40 years. 40 years I worked as an electrician in this city. I wired apartment buildings in the Bronx and office towers in Midtown, and a school gymnasium in the Bronx where I ran conduit for 3 weeks straight in February cold that made your fingers stop working properly after an hour. I managed my own crew, filed my own taxes, raised a son, buried a wife, and kept every utility bill paid on time through all of it. And now my son was telling me in a voice so reasonable it made my back teeth ache that he'd taken it upon himself to lock my bank card because I left my keys in the door. Before I could say a single word, the phone shifted. A new voice came on. "Sandra. Dad." She said it the way you'd say it to a child you were losing patience with. "If you need to buy something, anything at all, just text Derek first and we'll approve it. It's really not a big deal. We just want to make sure you're taken care of." The line went quiet. She'd said her piece. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was finished. I looked up at the tile ceiling of the 86th Street station. A woman's voice on the intercom announced a downtown 4 train in 3 minutes. Somewhere on the platform, a busker was playing "Georgia on My Mind" on a saxophone, slow and aching and completely indifferent to what was happening at the turnstile. "All right," I said. "I'll figure it out." I ended the call. Didn't slam it, didn't raise my voice, didn't give either of them a single syllable they could later describe as agitated or confused or unstable. I just ended it. put the phone in my coat pocket, and opened my wallet. Margaret had told me on our wedding night, not exactly the most romantic advice a new bride ever gave, but that was Margaret: always keep a 20 tucked behind your license. Not for emergencies. For the moments when someone tries to make you feel like you have nothing. She'd grown up in a family where that lesson meant something. I'd married into it. And in 41 years together, I'd kept that 20 in the same spot in every wallet I'd ever owned. I pulled it out. Now walked to the MetroCard machine, fed it in, and added fare to a backup card I'd kept in my breast pocket for the last 6 months. 6 months. That's how long I'd known something was wrong. Not suspected known. The way you know when a wire's been cut somewhere inside a wall you can't open yet. The circuit's dead, the breaker's fine, the outlet's new, and everything looks perfectly normal right up until it doesn't. It started in April with a phone call. Derek casual asking what I thought the apartment might be worth these days. A week later, another call hypothetically speaking what did updating a will usually involve. Then a visit in May, Sandra asking sweetly if she could use my laptop to check her email because her phone was acting up. She'd sat in my kitchen for 2 hours. I hadn't thought much of any of it individually. Individually, none of it meant anything. But I was an electrician for 40 years. I know what a wiring diagram looks like. I know how to read a pattern. So in late April, I'd started writing things down. A small notebook, black cover college ruled that I kept in the left drawer of my nightstand. Dates, times, exact words when I could remember them. Every question Derek asked about my finances. Every time Sandra mentioned my memory. Every login notification from my bank account that I didn't recognize. By October, that notebook had 63 entries. The downtown 4 train arrived with a rush of warm underground air. I got on, found a seat near the door, and held my coffee bought with cash from the corner bodega on 85th, $2.50 real price of a real cup, and watched the tunnel walls blur past the windows. I wasn't going to Derek's apartment anymore. Not today. I was going to Carol Briggs's office, and I was bringing the briefcase I'd packed 3 days ago, because some part of me had known this morning was coming. I just hadn't known it would start with a MetroCard. Carol Briggs had been practicing law in Midtown Manhattan for 25 years, and her office looked exactly like it. Bookshelves floor to ceiling on 2 walls, the spines cracked and color faded from actual use. A coffee maker in the corner that ran all day and produced something closer to motor oil than anything you'd find at a cafe. Case files stacked in a system that looked like chaos and apparently worked perfectly because Carol could pull any document she needed in under 30 seconds without looking. I'd tested that once, years ago, when she handled Margaret's estate. She'd retrieved a 17-page trust amendment while carrying on a conversation without breaking stride. She looked up when I walked in. Walter. Not a question. She'd been expecting me, though I hadn't called ahead. Some people just read the weather right. I set my briefcase on her desk, brown leather worn at both corners, the same one I'd carried to job sites for 20 years before Margaret bought me a new one, and I kept using the old one anyway because it felt like the right weight in my hand. Carol looked at it, then looked at me, then pushed her coffee mug aside and folded her hands on the desk. "Tell me," she said. So I did. The MetroCard. Derek's voice already prepared, already practiced. Sandra picking up the phone like a relay runner, taking a baton, smooth rehearsed, no gap between them. The message delivered in stereo: "You need permission now, old man." Carol didn't interrupt once. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her, but she didn't write anything down while I talked. She just listened the way good lawyers listen, not for what you're saying, but for what's underneath it. When I finished, I opened the briefcase. "I didn't come here with just a story," I said. What I laid on Carol's desk that morning wasn't something I'd thrown together after the MetroCard. I'd been building it since late April, 6 months of careful, systematic documentation, organized into 4 manila folders, each one labeled in my own handwriting. Bank statements printed and sorted by date with unusual login notifications highlighted in yellow. Screenshots of text messages from Derek, each one innocent on its own. "Hey Dad, just curious, what do you think the apartment's worth these days?" But arranged in chronological order, forming something that looked a lot less like small talk. A log of every conversation I'd noted in my black notebook, typed up and dated. And in the last folder, property records and LLC registration documents that Carol reached for first, her reading glasses coming off her nose as she leaned in closer. "What is this?" she said. That, I said, is the building Derek and Sandra live in. Carol looked up. "Stiwazi, I own it," I said. "Have since 2015. I set up a limited liability company, an LLC, which is a legal structure that lets you hold property separately from your personal assets. Keeps it protected, keeps it clean. I purchased the house through that LLC, and I've been leasing it to Derek for $1 a month. He never asked why the rent was so low. Never questioned how he qualified for a house that size on his income. He just moved in, painted the walls, and started acting like it was his." Carol set the document down slowly. "Does he know the LLC exists?" "He knows I own some rental properties. He doesn't know which ones." She picked up my bank statement folder next, flipping through pages with the steady efficiency of someone who'd reviewed thousands of financial documents and knew exactly what she was looking for. She paused at the login history section, a printout from my bank's security portal showing access timestamps and device information. "These notations," she said, tapping one page. "These aren't your devices." "No. My phone, my laptop, I know their signatures. Those 3 entries came from something else. I flagged them when they first appeared in August." Carol set the folder down and looked at me directly. "Walter, how long have you actually been watching this?" "April," I said. That's when Derek started asking questions. Not friendly questions, mapped questions. He called to ask about updating a will, which I answered generally. A week later, he asked what the apartment might sell for. The week after that, he asked how someone would go about liquidating business assets if the owner wasn't actively managing operations anymore. I watched Carol's expression shift, not shock exactly, but a particular kind of recognition. The look of someone assembling a picture they've seen variations of before. Individually, I continued. Every question was explainable. He's my son. Maybe he's thinking about the future. Maybe he's curious. But I ran a business for 40 years, Carol. I know what due diligence looks like. And I know what reconnaissance looks like. Those were not the same thing. So I'd started the notebook, dates and exact wording, because I'd learned decades ago that memory gets unreliable when money enters the room, not because people lie, but because everyone remembers conversations the way that makes the most sense to them. I wanted a record that didn't depend on my version or anyone else's. Just the date, the words, and the facts. Carol closed the last folder and took her reading glasses off, completely setting them on top of the stack. "They thought they were locking you out this morning," she said. "I know." "Walter." She leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I'd walked in, something shifted in her voice, not softer exactly, but more deliberate. "They locked themselves into evidence. Everything they've done in the last 6 months is documented in these folders. Every question, every login, every move." She tapped the stack with 2 fingers. "But I need to know something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right." "When did you first know, not suspect?" "No." I looked out her window. October light, thin and pale, falling across the rooftops of Midtown. "February 2021, I said. That's where it really started. And I need to tell you about a night in a garage in Queens, because without that night, none of the rest of this makes any sense. The garage smelled like motor oil and old concrete, and something else underneath both of those, the particular smell of a business that had stopped moving. Tools on the workbenches that hadn't been touched in weeks. A hydraulic lift frozen halfway up with nothing on it. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, one of them flickering at the far end, in a rhythm that made your eyes tired if you looked at it too long. Derek was sitting on a wooden crate near the back wall, holding a stack of papers against his chest, the way you'd hold something you were ashamed of, but couldn't put down. He was 37 years old that February night in 2021, and he looked 10 years older than that. His hair wasn't combed. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas 6 weeks earlier, when he'd laughed at my jokes and eaten 2 helpings of Margaret's sweet potato pie, her recipe, which I'd made alone for the first time that year, because Margaret had been gone for 14 months, and the pie still had to get made. Pete was already there when I arrived. My younger brother, 62 at the time, built like a man who'd spent 4 decades doing ironwork and hadn't quit yet, was crouched over a folding table with Derek's financial records spread out in front of him. Pete had that quality some people have of making you feel calmer just by being in the room. He looked up when I walked in, and the expression on his face told me everything I needed to know before Derek said a single word. "How bad?" I asked. Pete straightened up and handed me a sheet of paper. A summary he'd written out by hand, because Pete has always believed that if a situation is serious enough, it deserves to be written in ink and read with both eyes. The number at the bottom was $178,000. Derek's auto repair shop owed $43,000 to parts suppliers who'd stopped extending credit 2 months ago. The IRS had assessed $38,000 in back payroll taxes from 2019 and 2020, with penalties accumulating every month he didn't address it. A business line of credit at the bank had been maxed, and the bank was threatening to call the loan, meaning demand full repayment immediately, which would trigger a cascade Derek couldn't survive. The remaining balance was scattered across smaller debts, insurance, equipment leases, a contractor he'd hired for a renovation he couldn't finish paying for. $178,000. I didn't ask how it happened. I knew Derek well enough to know that asking how would take the rest of the night and produce nothing useful. Derek had always run close to the edge, talented with his hands, not gifted with the paperwork side of running a business. I'd tried to teach him. Some lessons don't take no matter how many times you offer them. "What needs to be paid first?" I said. "And when?" Derek looked up from the crate. His eyes were red, not from crying, from not sleeping, from staring at numbers that wouldn't change no matter how long he looked at them. "Dad, I can't ask you to..." "Derek." I said it the way I used to say it when he was 12 and about to argue himself into a corner. "What needs to be paid first?" he told me. Pete and I sat with him for 3 hours, working through each creditor in order of urgency. By midnight, we had a sequence. By the following weekend, I had liquidated a portion of my personal investment account, a brokerage account I'd been contributing to since 1987, money set aside in index funds that had grown quietly for 34 years. I withdrew enough to cover the supplier debts and the IRS assessment in full. For the bank loan, I did something I hadn't done since I was 29 years old, and borrowing against nothing to buy my first set of professional tools. I went to my bank, and I used my apartment as collateral, pledged the deed of my own home to guarantee Derek's business debt. The bank approved it within 4 days. I negotiated the IRS payment plan, personally called them, directly explained the situation, requested penalty reduction. They granted partial relief. I documented every call, every agreement, every payment confirmation in a folder I labeled simply February 2021. 6 weeks after that night in the garage, Derek's shop was clear. He never paid back a single dollar. I never asked him to. That was my choice, made deliberately, not because I was naive about money, but because I understood something about fathers and sons that has nothing to do with accounting. You don't save your child and then hand him an invoice. Sandra never knew about that night. Derek had kept it from her completely, which I didn't fully understand at the time. Later I would. What I do know is this: during those 2 weeks in February, while I was making phone calls and signing documents and transferring money, Derek wrote me 3 letters. Not texts, actual letters, handwritten on lined notebook paper, the kind you pull from a spiral pad. His handwriting was shaky in a way I'd never seen before. The letters uneven, the pressure on the pen too hard in some places, and barely there in others. The handwriting of a man who was holding himself together with whatever he had left. I read them twice each when they arrived. Then I drove to Pete's apartment in Astoria, and I handed Pete the envelope. "Keep these," I told him. "Don't ask me why, just keep them somewhere safe." Pete took the envelope without a word, which is one of the reasons he's been my brother for 65 years and my best friend for most of them. He tucked it between 2 binders on his bookshelf, and there it stayed for the next 2 years and 8 months. I came back to Carol's office window to the October light falling pale across the Midtown rooftops. "He wrote 3 letters during those 2 weeks," I said. "Pete still has them." I paused. "And 3 months ago, I opened my safe and the promissory note was gone." Carol didn't move when I said it. She just held her pen above the legal pad and looked at me with the careful stillness of someone who has learned, after 25 years of practicing law, that the moment a client says something important is not the moment to react. "The promissory note," she said. "Walk me through it." A promissory note is a legal document, a written promise to repay a specific amount of money signed by the borrower, dated and kept by the lender as proof the debt exists. When I lent Derek $178,000 in February 2021, I had him sign one. Not because I planned to sue my own son, but because 40 years of working with contracts had taught me that handshakes are for people who never have to prove anything. I kept that note in my safe, a fireproof steel box bolted to the floor inside my bedroom closet, the kind that requires both a combination and a key. 3 months ago on a Tuesday night in July, I opened that safe to retrieve my passport for a trip I was planning. The note was gone. In its place was a single sheet of white printer paper, blank on both sides, folded into thirds. Someone had swapped it out. "Who has access to your safe?" Carol asked. Theoretically, no one. Practically, Sandra was alone in my apartment for 2 hours in June. She asked to use my laptop while I ran to the hardware store. Said her phone was dead and she needed to check something for work. I felt my jaw tighten at the memory. I was gone an hour and 40 minutes. I came back and she was sitting exactly where I'd left her laptop closed. Very pleasant, asked me if I'd found what I needed at the store. Carol wrote something on her legal pad. "Did you notice anything unusual when you came back?" Nothing I registered at the time. But when I found the blank paper in July, I started replaying that afternoon. My bedroom door. I keep it open when I'm home alone, habit from living with Margaret for 40 years. She didn't like closed doors inside the house. That afternoon, when I came back from the hardware store, my bedroom door was closed. Carol set her pen down. "You're certain?" I spent 40 years noticing things other people miss. A wire 2 millimeters off from where it should be. A junction box installed at the wrong angle. My bedroom door closed when it should have been open. I looked at her steadily. "I'm certain." She nodded, then pulled my bank statement folder back toward her and opened it to the section I'd tabbed with a red sticker, the login history printout from my online banking security portal. Banks maintain detailed records of every device that accesses an account. The device type, its unique identifier, the IP address it connected from, and the exact timestamp. Any device that hasn't been previously authorized shows up flagged. 3 entries, Carol said, reading. Go to August 4th, the August 19th, and September 7th. None of those are my phone or my laptop. I know their signatures, I checked. Carol looked up. What were they accessing? Account balances? Transaction history? The wire transfer function? I paused. They didn't complete any transfers on those dates, but they were learning the layout, testing what was there. Carol tapped the page twice with her finger, a quick controlled motion that I'd come to recognize as the thing she did when something confirmed what she'd already been thinking. Then she picked up her desk phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. Frank, she said. It's Carol Briggs. I need 20 minutes with you this week. I have a client situation that involves your branch. A pause. Yes. Walter Greer. Another pause, shorter. Tomorrow works, 8:30. She hung up and looked at me. Frank Delano, she said. He's been managing the Citibank branch on 72nd Street for 18 years. I've worked with him on 2 previous cases involving unauthorized account access. He's meticulous, and he takes this seriously. She folded her hands on the desk. But before we get to the bank, I need you to check something tonight. Log into your online banking account and go into the security settings, specifically the account recovery section. Look for any email addresses listed under backup recovery options that you didn't put there yourself. I did it that evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I remembered to drink it. The security settings loaded. Under account recovery, 2 email addresses. The first was mine, the address I'd used for 20 years, the one Margaret used to send me grocery lists from. The second was an address I had never seen before in my life, a Gmail account with a string of random letters and numbers added on June 14th. The same week Sandra came to use my laptop. A backup recovery email is the key to an entire online banking account. Whoever controls that email address can request a password. Reset, receive the reset link, create a new password, and lock the original owner out completely, all without ever knowing the original password. Sandra hadn't hacked my account the afternoon she sat in my kitchen. She'd done something more patient than that. She'd installed a back door and walked away, leaving it closed behind her, waiting for the right moment to use it. I called Carol from the kitchen table, my voice steadier than my hands felt. There's an email address in my recovery settings that isn't mine. Added June 14th. Carol was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Screenshot it. Don't touch it. Don't remove it. We want it exactly where it is. Another pause. Walter, she wasn't checking her work email that afternoon. She was building a back door into everything you own. I looked across the kitchen at the chair Sandra had been sitting in 4 months ago, pleasant and unhurried, asking me if I'd found what I needed at the hardware store. I know, I said. And tomorrow I'm going to see Frank Delano. There are things you build for your children that you never expect to be turned against you. The house on Cloverton Street in Brooklyn had a red front door. I painted it myself in the spring of 2016, a Saturday morning in April, when the weather had finally turned and Derek had gone to pick up sandwiches and Sandra was supposedly running errands. I'd wanted to surprise them. I spent 4 hours on that door, 2 coats of Benjamin Moore Caliente, the red, that Margaret had loved on our first apartment, back in 1979. When Derek came back with the sandwiches and saw it, he laughed and hugged me in the driveway, and for a few minutes everything felt the way it was supposed to feel between a father and a son. I thought about that morning as I walked down Cloverton Street in November, hands in my coat pockets, breath coming out in small white clouds. The maple tree on the front lawn had gone bare. The red door looked exactly the same. I rang the bell at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning. Sandra opened the door. She was dressed and fully composed at that hour the way she always was. Sandra operated on a schedule that never seemed to slip, which I used to admire and now understood differently. She took one look at me, and her expression settled into something I had learned to recognize: the particular arrangement of her features that she deployed when she wanted to appear concerned and in control at the same time. Eyebrows slightly drawn together, mouth soft, eyes steady. "Dad." She said it quietly, like a doctor about to deliver a diagnosis. "I wasn't expecting you." "I was in the neighborhood," I said. "I wanted to see Mason." She shifted her weight just slightly, positioning herself more squarely in the doorframe. "I don't think that's a good idea today. Dad, your mental state has been unstable lately. I've noticed some things that concern me, and honestly, I don't want Mason picking up on that kind of anxiety. Kids absorb more than we realize." My mental state. I had wired 3 office buildings in Lower Manhattan. I had managed a crew of 12 electricians for 11 years, without a single serious injury on the job. I had filed my own taxes for 4 decades and negotiated directly with the Internal Revenue Service on my son's behalf 18 months ago. My mental state was functioning precisely as it always had. I kept all of that behind my back teeth. "Sandra," I said, "I would like to see my grandson." From somewhere inside the house came the sound of small feet on hardwood floors, moving fast, the specific rhythm of a 7-year-old running towards something rather than away from it. Then Mason appeared from around the corner of the hallway in his socks, eyes wide and already bright. "Grandpa." He said it like an announcement, like the best news of the morning. He was 3 steps into the entryway when Sandra moved. She stepped back, reached out, and took Mason by the shoulder, turning him back toward the hallway in one smooth motion. Not rough. Practiced. The way you redirect a child when you've done it enough times that it no longer requires thought. "Mason, go back to your room, baby. Grandpa can't stay today." "But Grandpa just got here." "Mason." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was something in the flatness of it that stopped him completely. He looked at me over his shoulder, and the brightness in his eyes went through something complicated confusion, then something quieter and sadder than confusion. The look of a child trying to understand a rule that doesn't make sense. Sandra closed the door, not slowly, not apologetically. She closed it the way you close a door when the conversation is finished, and you were always the one who got to decide when that was. I stood on the front step and listened to the sound of Mason's footsteps retreating down the hallway inside. I stood there long enough that the cold worked its way through my coat collar. Then I walked back down the front path to the sidewalk. Across the street, the curtain in the ground floor window of the brown brick building moved. 2 weeks earlier, the last time Sandra had allowed me inside, she'd put my lunch plate on the kitchen floor. I had come for Mason's birthday, not a party, just a family dinner, the small kind, with takeout containers and paper plates. Sandra had set 4 places at the kitchen table herself, Derek Mason, and an empty 4th chair that I assumed was mine, until she carried a 5th plate out of the kitchen and placed it on the floor near the back wall beside the cabinet where they kept the dog food. They didn't own a dog. "The table's a little crowded, Dad," she said pleasantly. "You can eat here. It's fine." Mason had looked at the plate on the floor, then at me, then back at the plate. He was 7 years old, and he understood enough to know something was wrong, and not enough to know what it was or what to do about it. That was the worst part, watching him stand there in his birthday sweater, with his forehead creased, trying to solve a problem that a 7-year-old should never be handed. I ate on the floor. I finished every bite. And I drove home afterward and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to take the elevator upstairs. Mason remembered it. I know he did, because children remember the things that confuse them most deeply, the things that don't fit the shape of the world they've been building in their heads. They carry those moments quietly, like stones in a coat pocket, until they find someone safe enough to put them down with. He found Donna Marsh. Donna lived in the brown brick building directly across from Derek's house, 60 years old, retired after 32 years as a registered nurse at Lenox Hill Hospital, with a front window that faced Cloverton Street, and a habit of noticing things that other people walked past. She had introduced herself to me 2 years ago when I was replacing the porch light on Derek's house. And she had the quality of a woman who says exactly what she means and expects the same in return. The curtain moved again. Then the window opened 2 inches. "Mr. Greer." Donna called across the street, her voice low but carrying. "You want to come in for a minute?" I looked back at the red door. Then I crossed the street. Donna Marsh's apartment smelled like chamomile tea and old books and something savory on low heat in the kitchen. The particular warmth of a home that someone actually lives in as opposed to performs living in. She had plants on every windowsill, a bookshelf that had clearly run out of vertical space and started stacking horizontally, and a view of Cloverton Street that was direct, unobstructed, and explained a great deal. She poured me a cup of tea, without asking whether I wanted one, which I appreciated, and set it on the coffee table in front of the armchair she'd directed me toward. Then she sat across from me with her own cup and looked at me the way I imagined she'd looked at patients for 32 years at Lenox Hill, not with pity, but with the focused attention of someone who needs accurate information and knows that the best way to get it is to make the other person feel safe enough to give it. "I've been watching that house for 8 years, she said. "Since you painted the door." "You remember that. Red door on a gray street, Mr. Greer. Hard to miss." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've also watched her shut that door in your face 4 times in the last 6 weeks. And I've watched your grandson stand at the upstairs window afterward and look down at the street for 20 minutes, like he's waiting for something that isn't coming back." My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my heart, and everything to do with the image of Mason at that window. "He told me something," Donna said. "About 3 weeks ago. He comes over sometimes. Sandra doesn't always know. He found out he could cut through the gap in the side fence and knock on my kitchen door, and I never told him not to." She'd looked at me directly. "He told me about a dinner. Said Grandpa had to eat on the floor because the table was crowded. Said he didn't understand why." She paused. "I've been a nurse for 32 years, Mr. Greer. I've reported things to authorities for less than that." I held the teacup with both hands and didn't say anything for a moment. Not because I had nothing to say, but because something about hearing it from Donna, clinical, precise, from outside the family, made it land differently than it had when I'd lived it. On the floor of my son's kitchen, watching my grandson's face. "Would you be willing to say that?" I asked. "What Mason told you, if it came to that?" Donna didn't hesitate. "I already wrote it down. Date, time, exact words. 32 years in nursing teaches you to document before you need to, not after." She reached to the side table and handed me a folded piece of paper. "That's my copy. Carol Briggs can have the original whenever she needs it." I looked at her. "You know Carol. I called her the day after Mason knocked on my kitchen door." The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "I told you. I've been watching that house for 8 years. I drove back to Queens that evening with Donna's folded paper in my breast pocket, and a feeling I hadn't had in several months, the specific sensation of not being entirely alone in something. Pete called at 9:14 that night. I was at my kitchen table with the black notebook open in front of me, adding that day's entries, Sandra at the door, Mason's face. Donna's statement when my phone buzzed and Pete's name came up on the screen. I answered on the second ring. Walt. His voice was careful, the voice he used when he was worried, but didn't want to lead with it. You doing okay? I'm fine, Pete. What's going on? A pause. Sandra wrote to me. Letter in the mail, actual envelope handwritten. Got it this morning. He cleared his throat. She says you've been wandering the neighborhood at night, talking to yourself. Forgot to turn the stove off twice last month. She says she's worried and she thought the family should know. I set my pen down on the notebook. She wrote it real nice, Pete continued, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice, the particular discomfort of a man who has received information that contradicts everything he knows, but is written convincingly enough to create doubt. Said she wasn't trying to cause trouble, just wanted to keep the family informed. Said you'd probably be upset if you knew she'd reached out, which is why she was going around you. I let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds. Pete, when is the last time you actually saw me wander anywhere? The pause on his end was longer than mine had been. Never. When is the last time I forgot something important, missed an appointment, got confused about a date, lost track of where I was? Walt, I'm not saying I believe it. I'm telling you what she wrote. I know you are. I picked up my pen again. Pete, I need you to do something for me. Don't respond to Sandra's letter. Don't call her. Don't write back. Don't tell her you talked to me tonight. Can you do that? Of course, but Walt, what's actually going on? Something I've been handling for 6 months. I'll explain everything when the time is right. But right now, I need you to sit tight and keep that envelope she sent you. Don't throw it away. Already in a drawer, he said. I wasn't going to throw it away. That was Pete. 65 years old, hands like a man who'd spent his whole life working with them, and an instinct for which things needed saving that I'd relied on since we were boys sharing a bedroom in the Bronx. There's something else, I said. The envelope I gave you 3 years ago. The one from February 2021. Pete went quiet for a moment. Still on the shelf. Between the union binders right where you put it. Keep it close, I said. And Pete, I'm going to need Ruth. I called my older sister after I hung up with Pete. Ruth Greer, 72 years old, retired after 38 years, teaching 8th grade English in the New York City public school system. A woman who had spent 4 decades making 13-year-olds understand that words had weight, and who applied the same standard to everything she read and heard. She had received a letter from Sandra, too. Identical talking points. Different handwriting pressure, same manufactured sorrow running underneath every line. I almost called Derek. Ruth said, her voice tight with something between anger and relief. I was going to call him this weekend and ask what we could do. I'm glad you didn't, I said. Ruth, I need you to trust me for a few more weeks. She exhaled slowly. How few? Less than a month. 2 days later, Tommy Rhea sent me a screenshot at 6:47 in the morning with 3 words. You need to see this. The screenshot came through at 6:47 in the morning, while I was still in my bathrobe standing at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee to finish. My phone buzzed on the counter and I picked it up, expecting nothing in particular. Pete checking in maybe, or a bank notification. And instead, I was looking at a photograph of my living room that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. The picture showed a room in obvious disarray. Newspapers stacked unevenly on the coffee table. A cardigan draped over the back of the couch in a way that looked like it had been dropped there and forgotten. The kitchen visible through the doorway behind it, with what appeared to be unwashed dishes in the sink. The lamp on the side table was askew, tilted at an angle that made the whole room feel slightly unhinged. Beneath the photo and Sandra's handwriting, rendered in the Facebook caption font I had come to associate with carefully managed appearances, were the words, "Been so worried about Dad lately. Anyone who knows him, if you've noticed anything, please reach out. We just want to make sure he's okay." 47 comments. I could see the number even in the screenshot. 47 people had read those words, and the worry underneath them, and responded with the particular tenderness that gets activated when someone suggests that a person they love might be declining. My phone rang before I could process any further. Tommy Reyes. Walt. His voice was wide awake, which meant he'd probably been up since 5. Tommy had run his own electrical contracting business for 9 years now, and kept the hours of a man who understood that the first call of the day usually determined how the rest of it went. "Tell me that's not your apartment." "It's not my apartment," I said. "I know it's not. Your couch faces the other window, the one that gets the morning light. You moved it in 2019 because Margaret always said the afternoon glare gave her a headache, and after she passed, you kept it there because you didn't see any reason to move it back." He paused. "I've been to your place 112 times in 20 years, Walt. I know what your living room looks like." Tommy Reyes had walked into my life at 22 years old, referred by a foreman I trusted, with a 2-year apprenticeship under his belt, and a willingness to learn things the right way rather than the fast way. I'd taken him on for a commercial job in Midtown, and he'd stayed for 2 decades. When I retired, he'd come to the small dinner I'd allowed Margaret to organize, and he'd been the last one to leave, sitting at the kitchen table long after the others had gone, talking about the industry and the city and the way things were changing. And I'd thought then that this was the particular kind of loyalty that couldn't be manufactured or incentivized. It either grew or it didn't. "She dug up somewhere that looked enough like my place to pass," I said. "Or she staged it. Either way, she was in my apartment when she did it. I know." Tommy's voice tightened. "Walt, I took the screenshot at 5:30 this morning before she could think to take it down. 47 comments by then. Ruth had already responded. She said something like, 'We're all keeping an eye on things,' which means she'd already bought it." He exhaled hard. "I also saved the URL of the original post. Carol's going to want that." I had already moved to my desk and was opening my laptop. "What time did it go up?" "Timestamp says 11:48 p.m. last night. She posted it after you would have been asleep. Timed it so the overnight crowd could respond before you woke up. 11:48 at night. Sandra had sat somewhere in that house on Cloverton Street after Derek went to sleep, or possibly while he was in the next room, and she had staged a photograph or retrieved one she'd prepared earlier, and she had written that caption, and she had posted it to a network of family and mutual acquaintances who trusted her concern, because why would a daughter-in-law lie about something like this? Because she needed witnesses, I thought. Not for the photograph itself, but for the narrative underneath it. Each concerned comment was a potential voice in a future preceding a person who could say, "Yes, I'd seen signs too." Sandra had been worried for months. She wasn't building a post. She was building a record. I called Carol at 7:15. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was already at her desk. "Tommy Reyes sent me a screenshot last night," I said. "Sandra posted a staged photograph of what she's claiming is my apartment to Facebook. 47 family responses before it went up." Carol was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Is Tommy willing to testify that the apartment in the photograph is not yours?" He already told me he'd been to my place 112 times. He knows which way my couch faces. Good. I heard her writing. Walter, what Sandra did last night has a legal name. Defamation is the publication of a false statement of fact that damages someone's reputation, in this case implying to your entire family that you're mentally incapable of caring for yourself. Intentional infliction of emotional distress covers deliberate acts designed to cause severe psychological harm. Both are actionable under New York civil law. She paused. But right now, what I need is for Tommy to come into my office this week and give a formal statement about the photograph. Can you make that happen? I'll call him back in 10 minutes. One more thing, Carol said. Save every comment on that post. Screenshot each one individually if you have to. Those 47 people just became documented witnesses to Sandra's narrative, and we're going to need to demonstrate exactly how that narrative was constructed and distributed. I spent the next 40 minutes at my kitchen table with my laptop and my phone screenshotting every comment, saving every timestamp, building a folder that hadn't existed 2 hours ago. Outside my window, Queens was waking up a garbage truck. On the next block, someone's radio through a cracked window. The particular sound of a city that moved forward, regardless of what any individual inside it was dealing with. My coffee had gone cold. I drank it anyway. That same afternoon, Carol called back. Her voice carried a different edge than it had that morning, controlled, but with something moving underneath the control. Walter, I heard from Dr. Holloway. He called my office an hour ago. She paused. Sandra contacted his office yesterday and asked him to prescribe your medication for anxiety and disorientation. She told his receptionist you'd been experiencing episodes and that the family was very concerned. I gripped the phone until I felt my knuckles pull tight. Dr. Holloway recorded the call, Carol said. And he didn't prescribe anything. But Walter, that recording is now evidence of something considerably more serious than a Facebook post. Dr. James Holloway had been my family physician for 19 years, which meant he had seen me through Margaret's illness, through my own retirement, physical through the string of minor injuries that accumulate when you spend 4 decades doing electrical work with your hands. He knew my resting blood pressure, my cholesterol numbers, the particular way my left knee complained in cold weather. He had sat with me in his office 2 weeks after Margaret died and talked for 40 minutes about grief and sleep and the importance of not disappearing into either one. He was 61 years old, ran 3 miles every morning along the East River, and had the unhurried manner of a man who had decided early in his career that the most important thing a doctor could do was make a patient feel like they had his complete attention. He gave me that attention now across his desk in the Upper East Side office he'd occupied for 16 years, and what he told me made the muscles in my forearms go rigid under my coat sleeves. She called on a Wednesday afternoon, Dr. Holloway said. Asked to speak with me directly. When my receptionist said I was with a patient, she said it was a family emergency involving a vulnerable adult and asked to be put through immediately. He folded his hands on the desk. I took the call because that language, vulnerable adult, has specific clinical and legal implications that I take seriously. I wanted to hear what she had to say. What Sandra had said in a voice Dr. Holloway described as measured and appropriately distressed was that her father-in-law had been experiencing episodes of confusion and disorientation, that he had become agitated with family members without provocation, that he had on 2 occasions left the apartment building without his keys and been found by neighbors, and that the family was very concerned about his ability to manage his daily affairs safely. She had asked on behalf of the family whether Dr. Holloway could prescribe a mild anxiolytic and anti-anxiety medication to help stabilize his mood and reduce what she called his episodes of irrational suspicion. I want to be precise about what she was asking, Dr. Holloway said, looking at me directly. An anxiolytic prescribed for behavioral symptoms in an elderly patient, without a formal evaluation based solely on a family member's account, would have appeared in your medical records as documented treatment for anxiety and behavioral dysregulation. That documentation could then be submitted to a court in support of a guardianship petition. A guardianship petition is a legal filing in which a person asks a court to declare someone else mentally incapable of managing their own affairs and to appoint a guardian, often a family member, to make financial and personal decisions on their behalf. In New York State, the process is governed by Article 81 of the Mental Hygiene Law. If a court grants the petition, the person subject to it loses the legal right to control their own money, their own property, and in some cases, their own living situation. The petitioner must provide evidence of incapacity, which can include medical records showing a history of treatment for cognitive or behavioral issues. Sandra had been trying to create that evidence in my own doctor's office, using my own medical records. "I didn't prescribe anything," Dr. Holloway said. I told her I would need to conduct a full evaluation before considering any medication and that I couldn't discuss a patient's care with a family member without the patient's written consent. She pushed back, said the situation was urgent, and that getting me involved directly was meant to spare me the trouble of a formal process. He paused. That phrase, "spare me the trouble of a formal process," is when I started recording. He slid a small digital recorder across the desk. The recording was 4 minutes and 22 seconds. I listened to all of it with my hands flat on my thighs and my jaw set hard enough that I felt it in my temples. Sandra's voice was composed and warm and completely convincing, the voice of a woman who had practiced this conversation until it felt natural. She expressed concern without accusation, urgency without desperation, and concluded with a line that made my stomach turn over. "He's such a proud man, Dr. Holloway. He'd never ask for help himself. That's why we have to do it for him." I handed the recorder back. "Thank you for calling, Carol. I've seen this before," he said quietly. "Not often, but enough. A family member trying to establish a medical narrative before the patient knows it's being built." He looked at me with the steady attention he'd been giving me for 19 years. "Walter, I want you to come back Thursday evening, after hours when the office is closed. I want to administer a formal cognitive evaluation, the mini mental state examination, which is the standard instrument courts use to assess mental capacity. I want it witnessed, documented, and notarized on the same night." "Thursday," I said. "I'll be here." Carol called that evening while I was making dinner, a pot of soup from a recipe Margaret had made every November, the smell of it filling the apartment in a way that was both comforting and quietly painful. "I got the cloud access this afternoon," she said. The court had granted a preliminary discovery order, a legal authorization allowing Carol to access digital records relevant to the case, including files stored in the family cloud account that Derek and Sandra shared, and that I had been added to years ago as a backup contact. Walter, Sandra created a document 4 months ago, 23 pages. She titled it Behavioral Decline Report, Walter Greer. I turned the heat down under the soup and stood very still. "She sent it to a forensic psychiatrist in New Jersey," Carol continued. "Described specific incidents, dates, times, behaviors. Your supposed wandering. Conversations where you became confused about financial matters. An incident at Mason's school pickup where she claims you didn't recognize the teacher." She paused. "None of these incidents appear in your notebook because they didn't happen." "She invented them," I said. "She constructed them. There's a difference legally." Carol's voice was precise and controlled, and underneath the control there was something cold and focused, the tone of a person who has moved past surprise into strategy. Walter, a forced guardianship petition filed with fabricated medical documentation and a false behavioral history, is fraud upon the court. It is a felony in New York State. She paused. Thursday with Dr. Holloway. Don't be late. I stood at my stove with the soup going and the recorder's 4 minutes and 22 seconds, still running somewhere in the back of my head. And I thought about the word proud in Sandra's voice, the way she'd used it like a key designed to fit a specific lock. He's such a proud man. He'd never ask for help himself. She wasn't wrong about the first part. Frank Delano had the kind of face that made you feel like your money was safe. Not in the slick, reassuring way of someone trained to project confidence. Frank was 61 years old, heavy-set with reading glasses. He was always either putting on or taking off, and a handshake that felt like a man who had spent 18 years making decisions that actually mattered. He'd managed the Citibank branch on 72nd Street since 2005, which meant he'd navigated 2 financial crises, a pandemic, and more family disputes over account access than he cared to count. Carol had worked with him on 2 previous cases and told me before I walked in that if Frank Delano told me something could be done, it could be done, and if he told me it couldn't, I should believe him. I walked into his branch on a Thursday morning in early October and asked the receptionist for a private meeting. Frank came out personally, which Carol had arranged, and led me to a conference room with frosted glass walls and a table just big enough for 4 people. He closed the door, sat down, and looked at me with the focused attention of a man who had already read the situation summary Carol had sent over. "Tell me what you need," he said. I told him everything. The login attempts from unrecognized devices, the backup email Sandra had added to my recovery settings, the pattern I'd noticed someone learning the layout of my accounts, the way a person cases a building before deciding how to enter it. When I finished, Frank took his reading glasses off, set them on the table, and was quiet for a moment. That felt longer than it probably was. "There are 2 things I can do," he said. "The first is biometric verification on all transactions above a threshold you set. Biometric verification means that any transfer, withdrawal, or account change above that amount requires your physical fingerprint scanned at a branch terminal in person on the same day as the transaction. It cannot be completed remotely. It cannot be bypassed with a password or a recovery email." He looked at me steadily. "If someone tries to move money above that threshold without your fingerprint, the transaction doesn't just fail, it flags immediately and generates a report. Set the threshold at $5,000, I said. Frank nodded and made a note. "The second thing is more involved, and it requires coordination with the fraud investigation unit, and depending on how things develop, potentially with law enforcement." He leaned forward slightly. "We can establish what's sometimes called a monitored account, a secondary account that appears accessible from the outside, but is actually a controlled environment. Any attempt to transfer funds into or out of that account triggers an automatic forensic capture. Device identification, IP address, GPS coordinates, if the device allows it, and a timestamp accurate to the second." He paused. "If someone tries to use your credentials to move money into that account, we capture everything about them in the moment they do it." "A trap," I said. "A documented forensic event," Frank said. "Which is a trap, yes." We spent the next 40 minutes on the paperwork. Biometric enrollment required 3 scans of my right index finger on the branch terminal, a form authorizing the security protocol, and a secondary confirmation sent to my personal email. The monitored account required additional authorization from Frank's fraud investigation unit, which he initiated by phone while I sat across from him, speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who do this regularly and don't need to explain it to each other. By the time I left that branch on 72nd Street, my accounts had a layer of protection that hadn't existed 3 hours earlier. I should clarify the sequence because the timeline matters. I had first approached Frank in late July, 2 weeks after I found the blank paper in my safe and the biometric protocol and monitored account were in place by early August. What I did in October was return to add the second layer of documentation Frank had recommended. The first test of the system came on the night of August 4th, when someone tried to move $9,500 out of my primary checking account. The transaction was initiated remotely from a device that wasn't mine, using the password that Sandra had reset through the backup email she'd installed on my recovery settings. The biometric requirement stopped it cold. No funds moved. But the attempt generated a report device identifier IP address timestamp 11:23 p.m. Frank called me the next morning. "First attempt last night," he said. "Stopped at the verification gate. I'm sending you the report." I added it to the folder I'd labeled Banking Unauthorized Access and wrote the date in my black notebook. 6 weeks later, September 19th, a second attempt. This time, $17,000 initiated from a different device, a laptop the forensic report indicated, rather than a phone. The IP address traced back to the same residential location as the first attempt. The biometric gate stopped it again. Another report, another entry in the notebook, another call from Frank the following morning. "They switched devices," Frank said, "and the amount went up. That's a pattern, Walter. They're not stopping, they're adjusting." "I know," I said. "The monitored account hasn't been touched yet," Frank said. "But whoever this is, they're going to find it eventually. They've been working through your account structure systematically. When they find that account, and they try to move money into it, we'll have everything we need," I said. "Everything," Frank confirmed. IP device ID location facial recognition, if their device has it enabled, and a timestamped record of the exact transaction they attempted. It becomes federal evidence the moment they touch it. Wire fraud. The use of electronic communications to execute a fraudulent financial scheme is a federal crime under United States law, specifically 18 U.S. Code. Section 1343. A conviction can carry up to 20 years in federal prison. The moment Sandra initiated a transfer through an electronic system with the intent to steal, she had committed that crime regardless of whether the transfer completed. The monitored account wasn't just a trap. It was a federal case waiting to be opened. I drove home from that second call and sat in my kitchen with the two reports spread on the table in front of me. September and October both blocked, both documented. I thought about Sandra at my kitchen table 4 months ago, pleasant and unhurried, laptop closed, asking if I'd found what I needed at the hardware store. She had no idea I'd already changed the locks on everything that mattered. 3 weeks after the second attempt on a Friday night in November, my phone rang at 10:15 p.m. Carol's name on the screen. I picked up on the first ring. Carol's voice, when she called at 10:15 on a Friday night, had the controlled quality of someone who is managing their own reaction in real time, keeping it flat and professional, because the alternative was to let the anger through, and anger wasn't useful yet. "She did it," Carol said. "Tonight, $41,000. I was in my armchair by the window, a book open on my knee that I hadn't actually been reading for the past hour. Outside, the Queen's night was doing what it always did in November, cold coming in off the streets, the particular amber of streetlights through bare branches, a city that never fully quieted but changed its register after 10 o'clock. I set the book on the side table and sat forward. "Tell me," I said. 10:07 p.m. Someone used your online banking credentials to initiate a wire transfer of $41,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. Carol paused. "They sent it directly into the monitored account Frank set up. The transfer triggered the forensic capture the moment it was initiated. Device identification, a laptop the same one from the September attempt. IP address placing the device at a residential location in Brooklyn. GPS coordinates from the laptop's location services, which were enabled. Another pause shorter. And a Face ID capture. Face ID is the facial recognition system built into certain laptops and smartphones. It takes a photograph of the user's face to verify their identity before unlocking the device. When Sandra opened her laptop that Friday night and initiated the transfer, her laptop photographed her face automatically, as it did every time she opened it. That photograph was time-stamped and stored in the device's system log. When the forensic capture triggered, it pulled that log. "Frank has everything," Carol said. "He's already been on the phone with the fraud investigation unit. Walter, this is federal evidence. The moment she initiated that wire transfer with the intent to steal, she committed wire fraud under 18 U.S. Code 1343. The monitored account documentation is going directly to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." I sat in my armchair and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling you get when a circuit you've been testing finally completes not excitement, just the quiet confirmation that the current is running the way it was supposed to. "You said the same device as September," I said. "Same laptop, different time of night. September was mid-afternoon, tonight was after 10, and the amount increased again. 8,000 in August, 17 in September, 41 tonight." Carol's voice tightened slightly. That's not random variation. That's a progression. She's been testing the system's tolerance, each time increasing the amount as her confidence grew. "Except she was never testing the real system," I said. "She was testing the trap." Carol let that land for a moment. "Get some sleep, Walter. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. I'll have Frank's full report by morning." I didn't sleep immediately. I sat in the armchair for another 20 minutes looking out at the Queens streetlights. And I thought about a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks earlier in the Whole Foods on Columbus Avenue on the Upper West Side. Sandra had called me that morning pleasantly and asked if I wanted to come over and spend some time with Mason. She'd suggested meeting at the store first. She needed to pick up a few things for dinner, and Mason had been asking about me. I should have recognized the setup and the timing of her warmth, the specific pleasantness she deployed when she needed something to go a particular way. But Mason had been asking about me, and that was the part I heard. We met at the store entrance at 2 in the afternoon. Mason ran to me the way he always did, full speed, no hesitation. Like the distance between us was an obstacle he needed to eliminate as quickly as possible. I caught him, and he wrapped both arms around my neck and said right into my ear, "I missed you, Grandpa." 7 years old, and already understood that some things needed to be said directly. Sandra handed me her shopping basket. "I'll be right back. I forgot my card in the car. Can you watch him for a few minutes?" She was already walking toward the exit, unhurried, not looking back. I took the basket. Mason wanted to look at the cereal aisle, so we went to the cereal aisle. He was explaining to me with complete seriousness the relative merits of 2 different brands of granola when I heard the store's intercom crackle. "Security to the main entrance. Security to the main entrance." I didn't think anything of it. Stores call security for a dozen reasons. We stayed in the cereal aisle. 2 minutes later, a uniformed security guard appeared at the end of the aisle, followed by a police officer, a young woman in NYPD blue, who looked at me with the careful neutrality of someone who had been given information she hadn't yet verified. "Sir," she said, "I need you to come with me." Mason's hand found mine immediately. His fingers locked around 2 of my fingers with the grip of a child who has identified something threatening and responded the only way available to him. "Can you tell me what this is about?" I said. "We received a report," she said carefully. of a child being taken from the store entrance without parental consent. Filing a false police report is a crime under New York Penal Law, Section 240-50, a Class A misdemeanor carrying up to 1 year in jail. What Sandra had done standing outside a Whole Foods on Columbus Avenue was call the police and tell them her father-in-law had taken her son without permission. While I was in the cereal aisle helping her son evaluate granola, the officer asked me questions in the calm, methodical way that good officers ask questions when they're not sure what they're dealing with. Mason stood beside me the entire time, hand locked in mine, and when the officer gently asked him whether he knew who I was, he looked up at her with an expression of total bafflement and said, "That's my grandpa." We were looking at cereal. The store's security footage showed Sandra walking out of the main entrance, stopping 20 feet from the door, taking out her phone and making a call. It showed her standing in that same spot for the next 11 minutes, not moving toward the parking lot, not searching for anything in her bag, just standing and waiting. It did not show a woman who believed her child had been taken. The officer apologized to me before she left. I thanked her and meant it. She'd done her job correctly in an impossible situation. And that wasn't nothing. I found Sandra near the produce section when it was over examining avocados with the focused attention of someone who had been there the whole time. "Everything okay?" she asked without looking up. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I took Mason's hand and walked him to the checkout. I told Carol about the supermarket the next morning. She was quiet for 4 seconds, which I had come to understand was her version of an intake of breath. "The security footage," she said. "We need that footage." "I already called," I said. "They're holding it." The Thursday before Sandra's intervention, Dr. Holloway's office closed at 6. By 9:45 that evening, the waiting room was empty except for Carol and me. The overhead lights had been dimmed to half the receptionist's desk, dark. The magazine rack casting a long shadow across the linoleum. A janitor was running a vacuum down the hallway outside, the sound coming and going in a slow rhythm that made the room feel both ordinary and entirely unlike itself. Carol sat beside me with her briefcase on her knees, going through something on her phone, with the focused efficiency she brought to every waiting room in every building she'd ever sat in. I looked at the door to Dr. Holloway's examination room and thought about Sandra's 23-page report. Behavioral Decline Report, Walter Greer. 4 months of fabricated incidents. Dates and times and carefully described behaviors that had never occurred, assembled into a document designed to make a court believe that the man sitting in this waiting room could no longer be trusted to manage his own life. Sandra had sent it to a forensic psychiatrist in New Jersey. She had tried to get my own doctor to prescribe medication that would have appeared in my medical records as treatment for cognitive dysfunction. She had posted a staged photograph to a family social network and collected 47 expressions of concern. She had been building a case. Tonight we were building the rebuttal. Dr. Holloway opened his examination room door at 10 o'clock exactly. Behind him, seated in a chair near the window with a leather portfolio on his lap, was a notary public, a licensed official authorized by the state of New York to witness and authenticate legal documents, certify copies, and administer oaths. A notarized document carries a specific legal weight that an ordinary document does not. It means a credentialed witness was physically present, verified the identities of everyone involved, and certified that what was recorded actually occurred. Carol had arranged the notary 3 days ago. Also in the corner on a small tripod was a video camera, recording. "Walter," Dr. Holloway said, and gestured toward the examination table. "The Mini Mental State Examination, the MMSE, is a 30-point standardized test developed in 1975 and used by courts, hospitals, and care facilities across the United States to assess cognitive function. It tests orientation to time and places the ability to register and recall information, attention and calculation, language comprehension, and basic visuospatial skills. A score of 24 or above is generally considered within the normal range. Scores below 24 can indicate mild to moderate cognitive impairment, depending on the patient's age and education level. In guardianship proceedings in New York State, MMSE results are routinely submitted as evidence of a person's mental capacity or lack of it. Sandra had built her entire strategy on the assumption that if she described me as cognitively impaired, for long enough to enough people, a court would eventually believe it. The MMSE was the instrument that courts actually used to verify that claim. She had never considered that I might take it first. "Let's begin," Dr. Holloway said, settling into the chair across from me with his clipboard. The video camera's small red light blinked steadily in the corner. "What year is it?" 2023. "What season?" "Fall." "What month?" "November." "What is today's date?" "The 17th." "What day of the week?" "Thursday." He moved through the orientation questions with the calm pace of a man who had administered this test hundreds of times, and I answered each one with the same steadiness I had brought to 4 decades of electrical work. Not rushed, not performing, just accurate. He named 3 objects and asked me to repeat them: apple, table, penny. I repeated them. He asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s: 93, 86, 79, 72, 65. He asked me to spell the word world backward: DLROW. He showed me a pencil and asked me what it was. He asked me to read a written instruction and follow it. He asked me to write a complete sentence. He asked me to copy a geometric design, 2 overlapping pentagons, onto a blank sheet of paper. Then 5 minutes after he'd named the 3 objects, he asked me to recall them: apple, table. The third one sat just at the edge of my recall, present, but not quite retrievable the way a name sometimes is when you're reaching for it in a room with too many people. I said apple and table, and then I said, "The third one is just outside my reach right now." "Take your time," Dr. Holloway said. I tried for another 10 seconds. "I can't pull it back." He made a note. "Penny," he said. "Penny," I repeated. And the moment he said it, I could feel how close it had been, not gone, just briefly unavailable. Which is not the same thing at all, but I understood why it counted. Dr. Holloway put his clipboard down and looked at his scoring sheet for a moment. Then he looked up at me, and the expression on his face was the same one he'd given me for 19 years, attentive, direct, with a quality of genuine respect underneath the clinical distance. 29 out of 30, he said. "Walter, that is an excellent score for a man of any age. The single point you missed, the delayed recall of one word, is well within the normal range for adults over 60. There are no indicators of cognitive impairment, no deficits in orientation, attention, language, or executive function. You are, by every clinical measure I can apply tonight, fully capable of managing your own affairs." Carol leaned forward in her chair. "I need that in writing, James. Signed, notarized, and dated tonight." "Already drafted," Dr. Holloway said, and turned to the notary. The notary, a compact man in his 50s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had witnessed 10,000 documents and found each one equally serious, opened his portfolio. He verified my identification. He verified Dr. Holloway's medical license number. He read the evaluation report aloud slowly while the camera recorded every word. Then he applied his seal and his signature to the bottom of the document, pressed his embossing stamp into the paper with a sound like a single firm handshake, and handed Carol the original. Carol held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. "Evidence packet number 3, she said quietly. She built her case on a man losing his mind. She looked up at me. We just proved he never did. I looked out Dr. Holloway's window at the November night pressing against the glass. The amber of streetlights, the dark shapes of buildings, a city indifferent and enormous and entirely unconcerned with what had just happened in this examination room. Somewhere out there on Cloverton Street in Brooklyn, Sandra was sleeping. Or not sleeping. Planning the Saturday she had been building toward for months. She had no idea what was in Carol's briefcase. "One more day," Carol said, standing and buttoning her coat. "Then it's Saturday." I stood up and shook Dr. Holloway's hand. His grip was firm and steady and said everything that needed to be said without saying any of it, walking out into the cold November air. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not confidence exactly, and not anger, but the particular clarity that comes when you have done every single thing you could do, and the work is finally finished, and all that remains is to let it be seen. Tomorrow was Friday. Friday would bring one more thing, the last piece Sandra didn't know was coming. I woke up at 5 in the morning without an alarm, not because I'd set one and it hadn't gone off, but because my body understood that something significant was happening today, and had decided, without consulting me, that sleeping through it wasn't an option. I lay in bed for 2 minutes, listening to the particular silence of a Queens apartment at 5 a.m., the heat coming through the radiator in slow metallic ticks. A bus on the street below, making its first run of the morning, a sound so routine and indifferent that it existed entirely outside of whatever was happening in this room. Then I got up. I shaved carefully the way I hadn't in months. Not the quick, functional shave of a man getting through his morning, but the deliberate kind, with attention to the angle of the razor and the temperature of the water. The way Margaret used to say, a man who takes care of the small details is a man who takes care of everything. I dressed in my gray slacks and my navy blazer, and the watch my father had given me when I turned 40, a Bulova, simple and reliable, the kind of watch that doesn't announce itself, but keeps perfect time for 50 years. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. 68 years old. 4 decades as an electrician. A son I had saved from bankruptcy, and a daughter-in-law who had tried to have me declared incompetent. A briefcase full of evidence and a lawyer who knew exactly what to do with it. I looked like exactly what I was. Pete arrived at 7:15 in his pickup truck, wearing his good flannel shirt and a jacket I recognized from his son's college graduation 6 years ago. He had the brown manila envelope on the passenger seat. When I got in, the one he'd kept between his union binders in Astoria for 2 years and 8 months, the one containing 3 handwritten letters from a desperate February night in 2021. "You eat," he said. "Coffee," I said. That's not eating." He handed me a paper bag from the diner on 31st Avenue. Egg and cheese on a roll, the kind of breakfast that had been the same in every Queens diner for 40 years, and would presumably continue to be the same for 40 more. I ate it while Pete drove, and neither of us said much, because there was a great deal to say, and none of it needed to be said yet. We drove across the bridge into Brooklyn, as the November sun was coming up low and pale over the rooftops, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything, but illuminates everything with a particular clarity that ordinary daylight doesn't have. Pete turned onto Cloverton Street and slowed to a stop 3 houses down from the red door. The house sat quiet in the early morning. Curtains drawn on the ground floor. A light on in this kitchen visible through the gap at the edge of the curtain. Someone was up or had left it on through the night. The maple tree on the front lawn had dropped the last of its leaves and stood bare against the pale sky, and the red door looked exactly as it had when I painted it 9 years ago. "You want to tell me about the house?" Pete said. "I've been meaning to," I said. In 2015, when Derek's auto shop was struggling for the 3rd consecutive year, and Sandra was pregnant with Mason, and the apartment they were renting in Flatbush was too small and too expensive, and their credit history made a conventional mortgage application a long shot. At best, I had done something that I told no one. Not Pete, not Ruth, not Carol at the time. I had established a limited liability company, a separate legal entity distinct from my personal finances, used to hold assets in a way that provides protection and flexibility, and I had purchased the house on Cloverton Street through that LLC. The LLC was the legal owner of record. I was the sole member of the LLC, which meant I owned the house in every sense that mattered, through a structure that wasn't visible in a simple public record search, unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. I had leased the house to Derek and Sandra for $1 per month. $1 because New York State requires a lease to have some form of consideration, some exchange of value to be legally enforceable. $1 made it a valid contract. The lease was on file in Carol's office had been since 2015 and gave me the legal right to terminate it with 60 days written notice under New York residential property law. Derek had never asked why the rent was so low. He had never questioned how they had been approved for a house of that size given their financial history. He had painted the interior walls the first summer, planted a small garden along the south fence, hung a basketball hoop in the driveway for Mason, and acted in every respect like a man who owned his home because nothing in his daily experience had ever suggested otherwise, which was the point. I wanted him to have that feeling. I wanted my son to walk into a house and feel like a man who had built something, even if the foundation under him was mine. He doesn't know, Pete said. It wasn't a question. He knows I own rental properties. He doesn't know which ones. Pete looked at the house for a moment. And the mortgage, Carol had discovered it during her preliminary asset review. Derek had taken the deed documentation that Sandra had found in the filing cabinet during one of their visits and had used it to approach a private lender, the kind that operates outside conventional banking channels and charges interest rates that compound faster than any legitimate institution would permit. He had pledged the house as collateral for a loan of $38,000. The legal term for pledging a property as collateral without the actual owner's consent is mortgage fraud, a felony under both New York state law and federal statutes. He had borrowed $38,000 against a house he didn't own to cover gambling debts that Sandra didn't know the full extent of, using documents he had taken without permission. That's why the LLC, I said. The moment Derek pledged that deed, he pledged something that wasn't his to pledge. The transaction is void. The lender has no valid claim because Derek had no authority to offer the collateral. Pete turned the envelope over in his hands. And today, I looked at the red door, at the basketball hoop in the driveway that I could see from this angle, one side of it catching the early light, at the curtains drawn across the windows of the house I had bought for my son because I wanted him to have something solid to stand on. Today, I said, she's chosen this house as the place to make her move. She picked it because it's Derek's home neutral territory, she thinks, where I'll be surrounded and outnumbered. I looked at Pete. She has no idea it's the one place in this entire city where I hold absolute legal ground. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he put the truck in drive. Let's go get some more coffee, he said. We've got a few hours. Pete parked 3 houses down from the red door at 4:45 in the afternoon. The November light was already going, that particular early evening dimness that settles over Brooklyn in late autumn like a held breath, the sky fading from pale gray to something darker at the edges. Streetlights beginning to think about coming on. Through the windshield, I could see the house on Cloverton Street, with its lights burning warm in the windows, silhouettes moving behind the curtains in the unhurried way of people who believe they are in control of what is about to happen. I counted 4 cars I recognized parked along the block. Ruth's Honda Civic navy blue, the one she'd driven since 2018 and refused to replace because, as she put it, the car had never done anything wrong and didn't deserve to be abandoned for something newer. Tommy Reyes's white work van, his company name stenciled on the side in the plain block letters he'd chosen when he started his business. Nothing fancy, just his name and his trade and his phone number, which was the approach I'd always respected about Tommy. A sedan I recognized as belonging to my cousin Louise's son, Robert, who had driven in from Long Island, and who Sandra had called 3 weeks ago with a carefully worded message about family concern and the importance of showing up. And a car I didn't recognize, which meant someone new had arrived. Someone Sandra had added to the list after the first round of phone calls. 15 people, Carol had told me. Sandra had made 15 calls. Pete turned off the engine. The truck went quiet, the heater ticking as it cooled, and for a moment the only sound was the street, a dog barking somewhere on the next block, a child on a bicycle navigating the sidewalk with the focused intensity of someone who had recently learned how a city continuing its Saturday in complete ignorance of what was happening on this particular stretch of Cloverton Street. "Ruth's already in there," Pete said, looking at the Civic. "I know." I looked at the house. "She needs to see this herself. Everything I've told her over the phone, she needs to watch it happen in front of her." Pete was quiet for a moment. He had the brown envelope in his lap, both hands resting on it with the particular stillness of a man who understands the weight of what he's holding. 3 letters. 3 handwritten pages from a February night in 2021. Derek's desperate handwriting, uneven and too hard in some places, and barely there in others, the handwriting of a man who had run out of everything except the hope that his father would answer. The passenger window tapped. I turned. Donna Marsh was standing on the sidewalk in her good wool coat, charcoal gray, the serious one she'd probably worn to church that morning, with her hands in her pockets, and an expression that communicated without ambiguity that she had not come to observe. She had come to participate. I rolled the window down. "Mr. Greer," she said. "Carol called me this morning, told me what time to be here." She looked at the house, then back at me. "I watched her shut that door in your face 4 times in 6 weeks. I listened to your grandson tell me about eating on the floor of his own kitchen." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I've been a nurse for 32 years. I've reported things to authorities for less than what I've seen on this block. I am not letting her do this in front of your whole family without someone in that room who saw what I saw." "To Donna," I said. "Thank you." She gave a single nod, the kind that means the thanks have been received and filed away, and we don't need to discuss them further. Then she stepped back onto the sidewalk and stood with her arms at her sides, waiting. A black sedan turned onto Cloverton Street and parked behind Tommy's van. Carol stepped out, briefcase in hand, wearing her long charcoal coat, and the expression she wore when she had already run the variables and was satisfied with the outcome. She walked to Pete's truck, leaned down to the window I still had open, and looked at me directly. "Everything's filed," she said. "The civil complaint was submitted to New York County Supreme Court yesterday afternoon. Wire fraud referral went to the FBI Financial Crimes Division this morning. Frank's forensic report is in my briefcase, along with the MMSE documentation, Donna's written statement, Tommy's statement about the photograph, Dr. Holloway's recording, and the cloud access evidence." She paused. "Walter, when you walk through that door, every piece of what Sandra has done for the past 8 months is documented, filed, and in the hands of people who know what to do with it." I looked at the red door. 9 years ago, I had stood in this driveway with a paintbrush and a can of Benjamin Moore Caliente and painted that door on a Saturday morning in April because I wanted to give my son something that felt like home. I had come back every year since, replaced a broken gutter, re-stained the back fence, installed a new water heater, when the old one gave out at midnight on a Tuesday in January, and Derek had called me in a panic. I had done all of it without being asked, and without keeping score, because that is what fathers do, and because I had believed for a very long time that love measured by what you give rather than what you're owed was the only kind worth having. I still believed that. Nothing that had happened in the past 8 months had changed it. But I had also learned something about love that I wished I hadn't needed to learn quite this way. That love without boundaries isn't generosity. It's an invitation. Pete picked up the envelope from his lap and held it out to me. I shook my head. "You carry it in," I said. "You've been holding it for almost 3 years. You should be the one who puts it on the table." Pete looked at me for a moment. Then he tucked the envelope under his arm and opened his door. I opened mine. The cold November air came in immediately, the particular cold of late November in New York, dry and clean, and carrying in it the faint smell of someone's fireplace 2 blocks away. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house one more time. Warm lights in the windows. 15 people inside, every one of them arriving with Sandra's version of events already loaded and ready. None of them knew that the man walking toward that red door had spent 6 months making sure the truth was louder than the story. I straightened my blazer, checked the Belova on my wrist, 4:58 p.m., and walked toward the door I had painted 9 years ago on a Saturday morning, when everything still felt like it was supposed to. Before I break down the exact moment every single piece of evidence hit the table, comment the number 100 below to let me know you've made it this far. Just a heads up, this next section includes fictionalized storytelling details and might not be 100% real. So if you'd rather skip the fiction, feel free to close the video here. 15 faces turned when I walked through the red door. Every single one of them was already wearing the expression Sandra had prepared them to wear, that particular arrangement of concern and sorrow that people put on when they have been told in advance what they are about to witness. My cousin Robert, near the window, hands clasped, mouth slightly tight. 2 of Margaret's nieces on the couch, leaning toward each other, the way people do when they need the comfort of proximity. Ruth in the armchair near the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, and when her eyes found mine across the room, I saw something in them that Sandra hadn't put there, a question, urgent and unresolved, that had been building since the letter arrived 3 weeks ago. Sandra stood at the center of the room. She was dressed carefully, not formally, but with the specific intentionality of someone who understood that appearance was part of the argument. Dark blouse, composed expression, hands clasped in front of her at waist height. She had arranged the furniture so that the armchair nearest the door was isolated slightly from the others, the way you'd position a chair in a doctor's office where the patient sits across from the people delivering the news. "Dad." She said it softly, with a weight of manufactured sorrow that she had clearly practiced. "We're so glad you came. Please sit down." Derek sat in the chair beside her. He hadn't looked up when I walked in. His eyes were fixed on the carpet between his feet, and his shoulders carried the particular hunch of a man who knows what is happening and has decided that not watching it is the closest thing to not participating in it that he can manage. I didn't sit down. Sandra smoothed her hands over her blouse, a small nervous gesture she'd probably been making for years without knowing it, and began. She spoke for 3 minutes without interruption, and I let her because every word she said in front of 15 witnesses was a word on the record. Confusion about financial decisions, difficulty managing day-to-day affairs, outside influences, she said it carefully, not naming Carol, directly taking advantage of a proud man's reluctance to ask for help. Then she lifted a stack of papers from the coffee table and placed them in front of the isolated armchair. "These are standard documents," she said. "A power of attorney, which is a legal authorization allowing a designated person to make financial and legal decisions on behalf of someone who needs assistance. Nothing complicated. We just need your signature, Dad, so we can make sure you're protected. Power of attorney in the form Sandra was presenting, it would have transferred complete legal control of every financial decision in my life to Derek. Every bank account, every property transaction, every contract, all of it subject to his approval. And through Derek, subject to hers. Derek finally looked up. His face was the color of old concrete, and his eyes had the look of a man who has been awake for 3 days, running the same calculation and never arriving at a different answer. He stood slowly, and his voice when he spoke was unsteady in a way that wasn't entirely a performance. Dad. He stopped, started again. You haven't been yourself. We can all see it. We're just trying to... Derek, I said. Do you remember February 2021? The room went still. Not quiet still. The particular stillness of 15 people simultaneously stopping whatever internal process they were running and redirecting their full attention to the same point. Derek's mouth stayed open for a moment, the sentence he'd been building dissolving before it reached the air. Pete stepped forward from behind me. He didn't hurry. He walked to the coffee table, moved Sandra's power of attorney documents to one side with a single deliberate motion, and set the brown manila envelope down in the space he'd cleared. My name is Pete Greer, he said to the room rather than to any one person. I'm Walter's brother. I was in that garage in Queens on the night of February 14th, 2021, when Derek called his father at 11 o'clock because his business was going under and he didn't know what else to do. He opened the envelope. I've been holding these for almost 3 years. He laid the financial documents on the table first. The IRS settlement confirmation stamped and dated. The bank loan guarantee showing Walter's apartment as collateral. The payment records for each supplier settled in full over 6 weeks. Sandra stared at the papers, and something shifted in her expression. Not fear yet, but the first recognition that the room was not behaving according to the script. Then Pete pulled out the letters. Derek wrote these during the 2 weeks after that night, Pete said. I'm going to read from one. Derek made a sound, not a word, just a sound low and involuntary. The sound of someone who has just understood that a door they thought was closed has been open all along. Pete read his voice, steady. Dad, if you don't help me, I don't know what I'll do. The shop is going under. Sandra doesn't know how bad it is. I'm begging you. Please. I need you to save me again. The room absorbed it. Tommy Reyes stood up from the chair near the window. I need to say something, he said, and his voice had the particular steadiness of a man who has thought carefully about exactly what he is going to say and in what order. That photograph Sandra posted to Facebook 2 weeks ago, the one showing Walter's apartment in disarray. I've been to Walter's apartment more than 100 times in 20 years. His couch faces the east window. It has faced that window since 2019. The couch in that photograph faces a different wall. He looked around the room. I have the original screenshot with the timestamp, and I've given a formal statement to Carol Briggs. Donna was already standing. I live directly across from this house, she said, her voice carrying the flat authority of a woman who spent 32 years in an emergency room and did not raise it for emphasis. I have watched Sandra close that door in Walter's face 4 times in 6 weeks, and 3 weeks ago, Mason came to my apartment and told me that his grandfather had been made to eat his dinner on the kitchen floor because the table was, quote, a little crowded. She looked at Sandra directly. I have that in writing, dated and witnessed. Sandra's composure shifted, not broke, but shifted like a wall that hasn't cracked yet, but has begun to lean. Carol opened her briefcase. She placed the bound folder on the coffee table beside Pete's documents, the civil complaint filed with New York County Supreme Court the previous afternoon. The FBI referral, Frank's forensic report showing 3 unauthorized transfer attempts, totaling $67,500. The Face ID capture from Friday night, Dr. Holloway's recording of Sandra's call requesting sedative medication, and the MMSE evaluation, 29 out of 30, notarized and witnessed. "I'm Carol Briggs," she said. "I'm Walter's attorney. Everything in this folder was filed or submitted yesterday. Sandra, you are welcome to have your attorney review it at your convenience." Ruth stood up. She didn't speak immediately. She crossed the room to the coffee table and picked up the IRS settlement document and read it right there while everyone watched. Then she set it down and looked at Derek with an expression I had last seen on her face when we were children, and one of us had done something that went beyond the reach of ordinary punishment. "You took Mason's medical insurance money," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely without tremor. "Carol told me this morning. You emptied the account Derek set up for Mason's health care to cover gambling debts." She looked at Derek. "Your 7-year-old son." Derek put his face in his hands. The room began to empty in the way rooms do when the thing everyone came to witness has become something no one wants to be seen, watching quietly, in ones and twos, people finding coats and reasons and the door. Robert touched my shoulder on his way out. Margaret's nieces left without speaking. The room reduced itself in the space of 10 minutes to the people who had always been on the right side of this and the 2 who hadn't. Sandra stood in the center of the room, surrounded by unsigned documents, and the silence of 15 people who had just discovered the distance between a story and the truth. Derek hadn't moved his hands from his face. I drove home from Cloverton Street alone that night. Pete had offered to follow me back to Queens the way he always did, after something difficult, not to talk, just to be in the vicinity in case talking became necessary. I told him I was fine, which was mostly true, and that I needed the drive. He squeezed my shoulder once and got into his truck, and I watched his taillights disappear around the corner before I started my own engine. The drive from Brooklyn to Queens at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night takes 25 minutes on a good night, and longer when you're not in any particular hurry to arrive. I was not in any particular hurry. I took the long way across the bridge, the Manhattan skyline, doing what it always did, sitting there enormous and indifferent and lit up against the dark sky, in a way that made every individual problem feel appropriately small without actually making it smaller. I had expected to feel something cleaner than what I felt. Relief maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a job that had been done correctly after a long time doing it. What I felt instead was tired in a way that went below the muscle level, the kind of tired that comes not from exertion, but from sustained vigilance from 6 months of watching every word, documenting every conversation, holding every reaction behind a composed exterior, while the people I had loved and provided for dismantled whatever trust had existed between us, one calculated move at a time. I felt that. And underneath it, something quieter and harder to name. Grief, maybe, for the version of my son I had spent 40 years believing in. Carol called at 9:15. "Sandra contacted an attorney tonight," she said without preamble. "She's filing an emergency guardianship petition, an expedited request to the court, to appoint a guardian immediately bypassing the standard evaluation period on the grounds that the subject poses an imminent danger to themselves or their assets." Her voice was measured and precise. Under New York Mental Hygiene Law Article 81, an emergency petition requires supporting documentation from a licensed medical professional attesting to the subject's incapacity. Without that documentation, the petition cannot be filed. "She doesn't have it," I said. "So she called Dr. Holloway's answering service tonight. His office will find the message Monday morning." She also called the forensic psychiatrist in New Jersey, to whom she sent the behavioral decline report. Carol paused. The psychiatrist called me this afternoon, Walter. He received the report 4 months ago. He did not act on it because the report lacked supporting clinical documentation. He had no examination findings, no objective test results, nothing he could submit to a court with his name on it. When I told him about the MMSE results from Thursday night, he said, and I'm quoting directly, that he was very glad he had trusted his instincts on this one. I was standing at my kitchen window, looking out at the Queen's night, a glass of water in my hand that I hadn't drunk from yet. So she has no doctor, I said. She has no doctor, Carol confirmed. Which means the emergency petition dies before it's filed. Standard proceedings take 60 to 90 days, which puts us well past the December 20th court date. She paused again, and in the pause I could hear her turning a page. Walter, I need you to understand something. What happened in that room today was significant. But Sandra is not finished. People who have been doing what she's been doing for 8 months do not stop because they've been seen. They adapt. What do you think she does next? She's going to try to reframe the narrative, Carol said. Position herself as the victim. The daughter-in-law who was only trying to protect her family and was blindsided by a legal ambush. She said it the way you describe a chess move your opponent hasn't made yet but will. Let her. Every move she makes from this point forward is documented and will be addressed at the December 20th hearing. I received a letter from the New York County Supreme Court on Tuesday morning, 3 days after the intervention. A formal notification of the civil proceeding Carol had filed with the hearing date confirmed December 20th, 10 a.m. courtroom 14. I held the letter in both hands at my kitchen table, reading it twice, and then I set it down and opened the black notebook to the last page that had anything written on it. The second to last entry from the previous Thursday MMSE completed. 29:30. Notarized. I turned to the next blank page and wrote one word, December. Then I closed the notebook. The calls from family started Tuesday afternoon. Robert first, my cousin's son, who had driven in from Long Island and left without speaking on Saturday. His voice on the phone had the careful quality of a man reassessing something he'd believed without enough examination. Walter, he said. I owe you an apology. Sandra called me 3 weeks ago and she was very convincing. I should have called you directly before I came. You came because you were worried about family, I said. That's not something to apologize for. I should have asked more questions. A pause. Is there anything I can do? Come to the hearing if you're willing. December 20th. Ruth called that evening. She didn't apologize. Ruth never apologized for things she considered reflexive human errors, rather than moral failures, which was a distinction she applied with great precision. What she said instead was, I should have called you the day I got that letter. And then, I'll be in that courtroom on the 20th. Front row. Derek left a voicemail on Wednesday morning. I listened to it twice, standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee. His voice was different from any version of his voice I had heard in the past 8 months. Not the easy, relaxed voice from the MetroCard morning. Not the shaky performance voice from the intervention. It was the voice from February 2021. Stripped down, exhausted, not managing itself. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't explain himself or offer a defense or try to reposition what had happened. He said, Dad, I need to talk to you. Not about the case, just I need to talk to you. And then after a pause that lasted long enough that I thought he might have hung up, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I am. I set my coffee down. I didn't call him back. Not yet. But I didn't delete the voicemail either. I played it a third time, and then I set the phone face down on the counter and stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the radiator tick and the street noise coming up from below, thinking about the two men my son could still be, and which one had just left that message. The next morning, December came in cold and clear over Queens. Derek called again on a Thursday morning, 4 days after the voicemail. I was at my kitchen table with coffee and the black notebook open in front of me. Not writing anything, just sitting with it. The way you sit with something you've carried a long time and are trying to decide whether to put down. When his name came up on my phone, I looked at it for 2 rings. Then I picked up. Dad. His voice had the same quality as the voicemail, stripped down, not managing itself. Thank you for answering. I didn't say you're welcome. I said, I'm listening, Derek. He was quiet for a moment. That felt like a man standing at the edge of something and making a final decision about whether to step. Then he stepped. I need to tell you about the recording, he said. The one Carol played at the intervention. Sandra threatening me. He exhaled slowly. I made that recording myself. September 14th. Sandra had been pushing me for weeks to get you to sign papers. And that night she told me if I didn't find a way to make you sign, she was going to file for divorce, take Mason, and find a way to have me criminally charged for the business debts. His voice tightened around the edges. She said it like she was telling me the weather. Just completely calm. That's when I understood what I had gotten into. Under New York state law, recording a conversation requires the consent of only one party, meaning Derek had the legal right to record Sandra without her knowledge because he himself was a participant in the conversation. The recording was admissible. It was evidence. Derek, I said. Why didn't you come to me in September? The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I could hear traffic somewhere near wherever he was sitting. Because I was ashamed, he said finally. Of all of it. The gambling, the money, the way I let her run over everything that mattered because it was easier than standing up to her. His voice broke briefly, then steadied. The letters I wrote you in 2021. I meant every word when I wrote them. And then I spent 3 years acting like they were never written. I looked out my kitchen window at the December morning gray sky, bare trees, a pigeon navigating the fire escape across the alley, with the focused determination of a creature that has no opinion about the cold. There are still 2 men you could be, I said. The one who wrote those letters, and the one who spent 3 years forgetting he wrote them. I paused. December 20th is your chance to decide which one you actually are. Not for me. For Mason. Derek didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than I had heard it in years. I'll be there, he said. And Dad, I have something for Carol. The courtroom was smaller than people expect. Courtroom 14 of the New York County Supreme Court on Center Street was a wood-paneled room with fluorescent lighting and high windows that let in December sky without letting in December warmth. 6 rows of gallery benches, a judge's bench elevated enough to require looking up 2 counsel tables facing forward, and the particular smell of institutional air, recycled, temperature-controlled, carrying in it the accumulated weight of every dispute that had passed through this room before ours. Ruth was in the front row of the gallery when I arrived, exactly where she'd said she'd be. Pete beside her, wearing the same jacket from his son's graduation. Tommy Reyes, at the end of the bench arms, folded the patient posture of a man who has cleared his schedule and intends to stay as long as necessary. Robert, 2 rows back, hands on his knees. Donna Marsh beside him, portfolio in her lap. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Carol. She had her briefcase open and her documents in order, and the focused stillness of someone who had been preparing for this specific morning for 6 months. Derek and Sandra came in separately. Derek entered from the left side of the courtroom alone. Without his attorney beside him, she was already seated at the defense table, and looked briefly startled when Derek walked past her without sitting down. He came to the plaintiff's table and placed a small digital recorder in front of Carol without saying anything. Carol looked at it, then at him, and gave a single nod. Derek went back to the defense table and sat at the far end of it, a deliberate physical distance from Sandra, who had not looked at him since he walked in. Judge Patricia Owens entered at 10:04. 60 years old, 23 years on the bench, with the precise, unhurried manner of a person who has heard every version of every argument and is interested only in what is documented and provable. She settled her reading glasses, opened the case file, and read for approximately 90 seconds in complete silence before she looked up. "Mr. Greer," she said, looking at Derek. "Before we begin, I want to ask you some questions directly, and I want direct answers." Derek sat forward. "Yes, Your Honor." "Who rescued your business from insolvency in February 2021? The courtroom was absolutely still. "My father," Derek said. "What was the total amount of debt your father resolved on your behalf?" $178,000. Did he secure any of that resolution using his personal property as collateral?" "His apartment," Derek said. "He pledged the deed." Judge Owens made a note. "Who is the legal owner of the residence you currently occupy on Cloverton Street in Brooklyn?" Derek's jaw tightened. "My father, through an LLC he established in 2015. "And you became aware of this when?" "Saturday, November 25th. A pause. "The intervention." Judge Owens looked at him steadily over her reading glasses. "Mr. Greer, help me understand something. Your father resolved $178,000 of your debt, pledged his home to do. It purchased the house you live in and leased it to you for $1 a month and covered your family's medical expenses on at least 2 separate occasions." She set her pen down. "So why does a man who has done all of that need his 40-year-old son's permission to ride the subway?" The gallery behind me was completely silent. Derek had no answer. There was no answer that didn't require saying out loud what the true purpose of the intervention had been. And saying it out loud in front of Judge Owens was something his attorney had presumably told him very clearly not to do. Frank Delano testified next. He walked the court through the 3 unauthorized transfer attempts with the methodical precision of a man presenting a quarterly earnings report. Dates, amounts, device, identifications, IP addresses, the forensic capture from Friday, November 18th, showing Sandra's Face ID photograph, time-stamped at 10:07 p.m. alongside the initiated transfer of $41,000 to an offshore account. Judge Owens asked 3 clarifying questions. Frank answered each one in under 30 seconds. Then Carol stood up and pressed play on Derek's recorder. Sandra's voice filled the courtroom. Calm, controlled, carrying the specific coldness of a person who has decided that the outcome justifies whatever is required to achieve it. "If you don't find a way to get the old man to sign those papers, I will file for divorce. I will take Mason, and I will make sure every cent of that business debt lands on you personally. Do you understand me?" "I'm not asking." The recording ran for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it ended, the courtroom remained quiet long enough for the silence itself to become a verdict. Sandra turned to her attorney and said something in a rapid, low voice. Her attorney put a hand on her arm. Sandra said something else louder. Then she turned to Derek and said in a voice the entire gallery could hear, "You recorded me. You actually recorded me." Derek looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away. Sandra's composure, which had survived the intervention on November 25th, by leaning rather than cracking, cracked now. She told Derek in front of Judge Owens and the gallery and the court reporter, whose fingers never stopped moving, exactly what she thought of him, of his family, of his failure to do the one thing she had needed him to do. Derek sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes forward, and let it happen the way a man accepts a consequence he has decided he deserves. Judge Owens let it run for approximately 15 seconds. Then she said quietly, but with absolute authority, "That's enough." The courtroom went still again. She picked up her pen. The scratch of it on paper was the loudest sound in the room. Full legal and financial authority of all assets belonging to Walter James Greer is unconditionally restored, effective immediately. All account authorizations previously granted to Derek Allen Greer are permanently revoked. Sandra Lynn Greer, you are referred to the District Attorney's Office for prosecution on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, filing of false documentation in a judicial proceeding, and filing of a false police report. Derek Allen Greer. She looked at him directly. The court notes your voluntary cooperation and self-disclosure which will be considered in any subsequent proceedings. She signed the order. The scratch of pen on paper. Outside the high windows, December snow had started to fall over Manhattan, quiet, indifferent, covering the city in the particular way that snow covers things without judgment, without distinction, laying itself down equally over everything that has happened and everything that is about to begin. I looked at my son. For the first time since the MetroCard morning in October, Derek looked back at me directly. His eyes were red and his face was a wreck, and he held my gaze for exactly 3 seconds before he looked down at his hands. It was enough. Carol touched my arm. "What now?" she said quietly. I looked out the window at the snow. "Now," I said, "I fixed the will." 2 days after the courthouse, I sat in Carol's office while a small Christmas tree blinked on the corner of her desk. She'd put it up sometime in the past week. Artificial, no more than 18 inches tall, with white lights and a single silver star at the top. It looked exactly like the kind of tree a person puts in their office when they want the acknowledgement of the season, without the obligation of the sentiment. Carol was not a sentimental woman, but she kept the tree and the lights were on, and I found that I was glad for both. Outside her window, Midtown was doing what Midtown does in the week before Christmas, moving fast in every direction. At once people with shopping bags and coffee cups, and the particular urgency of a city that has added one more deadline to an already impossible schedule. The snow from December 20th had mostly cleared, leaving the sidewalks wet and dark and reflecting the store lights in long, unsteady streaks. Carol spread the draft across her desk without ceremony. "Walk me through it," I said. She picked up her pen. 30% of your business holdings, the equipment, the client contracts, the company accounts receivable transferred into an irrevocable employee trust. An irrevocable trust is a legal structure that, once established, cannot be altered or revoked by the person who created it. The assets inside it are no longer considered part of the creator's personal estate. They belong to the trust, which is administered by an independent trustee according to terms set at the time of creation. The beneficiaries are any employee who has worked with you for 10 or more years. They receive voting rights, profit participation, and a genuine ownership stake. They cannot be bought out or removed by any outside party without unanimous consent. I thought about the men and women who had shown up on job sites in February, cold and August heat for 2 decades, who had done the work correctly and carefully and without complaint, who had trusted me to be straight with them about what the job was and what it paid. They had given me their best years. This was the version of a thank you that actually meant something. The real estate holdings, Carol continued. All properties currently held under the LLC structure, including the Cloverton Street property, are transferred into a separate irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary is Mason Walter Greer. She looked up. An independent institutional trustee administers the trust. No parent, guardian, or family member has access to or authority over the assets. Distributions are limited to verified educational expenses, tuition, books, housing during active enrollment, until Mason reaches 25, at which point he assumes full control. Mason would grow up knowing there was something solid waiting for him that no one could reach. Not because I wanted to make a point, but because that is what grandfathers are for building things that outlast the complications of the present and land in the future undamaged. "And Derek," Carol said. Her voice was careful, the way it gets when she is moving into territory she has an opinion about and has decided to keep it to herself unless asked. "And Derek," I said. I had spent the 3 weeks between the intervention and the courthouse thinking about this, and I had spent the 2 days since thinking about it more. The easy answer was disinheritance, a clean line drawn through his name, a statement that what he had done put him outside the boundary of what I was willing to leave behind. I understood the argument for it. I could feel the pull of it. And I rejected it not because what he had done was forgivable in any simple sense, but because cutting him out entirely would have been about my anger rather than his future. I was done making financial decisions based on my emotions. That approach had cost me enough. "The Dignity Recovery Fund," Carol said, reading from the draft. "A structured disbursement account in Derek Allen Greer's name, administered by an independent nonprofit financial counseling organization. A conditional bequest in New York State is a legal inheritance that transfers only upon the fulfillment of specified conditions. The beneficiary must meet the terms before the assets are released. Monthly disbursements covering basic rent at market rate for a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, a food and utilities allowance and tuition for an accredited vocational or professional certification program of Derek's choosing. Disbursements are contingent on monthly verification of enrollment and continued participation in a certified financial counseling program." She looked up. "If he stops participating, disbursements pause automatically. They resume when participation resumes. There is no penalty clause, just a pause." "And the message," I said. Carol turned to the last page. She read it aloud in the same tone she used for legal language, which was the right tone for it. "I am not leaving you money to spend. I am leaving you a road back to becoming an honest man. Whether you walk it is entirely your choice. I hope you do. Your son deserves a father who built something of his own." "Dad." The room was quiet for a moment. "Is this punishment?" Carol asked. She asked it the way she asked all her real questions, directly, without softening. I looked out her window at the wet midtown street, the store lights stretching across the dark pavement in long, unsteady lines. "No," I said. "It's the last real thing I can do for him without being there to catch him when he falls. If he wants what's in that fund badly enough to actually learn how to manage a life, then maybe it serves its purpose. If he doesn't want it that much..." I paused. Then he was never going to use it well anyway. And Mason's tuition grows a little larger. Carol made the final notations, turned the document toward me. I signed my name 11 times. Slowly, clearly, the deliberate signature of a man who knows what he is signing and why. When I set the pen down after the last one, my hand was steady and my mind was clear, and I felt for the first time in longer than I could accurately remember that everything I had built was pointed in exactly the right direction. Carol gathered the pages. "It's done," she said. I looked at the small Christmas tree blinking on the corner of her desk, its single silver star catching the light. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a bowl of soup from Margaret's November recipe, the same one I had made on the night Carol called about the behavioral decline report. The same smell filling the apartment, the same particular warmth of a recipe that has been made so many times. It has become something more than food. I looked at the photograph of Margaret on the shelf above the stove. Her face in the photograph, the way it always was, composed, direct, slightly amused, as though she could see something that hadn't happened yet and had already decided it was going to be fine. I kept my word, Maggie. I said to the photograph and to the apartment and to whatever part of 41 years together still moved around in the rooms of a place we had shared. Everything we built is going to the right people. I finished the soup, washed the bowl, turned off the kitchen light, and for the first time in 6 months, I slept through the night. 3 months later, I swiped my Metro card at the 86th Street station without hesitation. Mason held my left hand going down the stairs. At the bottom, Derek was waiting work clothes, honest exhaustion in his eyes, holding a $3 coffee he had bought with money he earned himself. He held it out without a word. I took it, wrapped both hands around the cup, and for a long moment, the three of us just stood there, in the middle of that station, while New York moved around us, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware that something small and significant had just been repaired. I believe God allowed me to walk through this not to punish me, but to show me what I had been too proud to see. Here's what I want to say, and I say it as a man who made this mistake for 40 years. Don't wait until your card gets declined to set limits with the people you love. Love your children with everything you have. But love without boundaries is not a gift, it is an open door that the wrong people will eventually walk through. These grandpa stories are not about winning, they are about waking up. In every family story that looks like mine, there is always a father who gave too much too quietly for too long. I was that father. Don't be. My personal belief in this family story confirmed it is that dignity is something you protect daily, not something you reclaim after the fact. If these grandpa stories have stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell me what you felt. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. The next story is already waiting for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with me until the very end. One last thing, some of the stories ahead contain fictional elements shaped to carry a truth worth hearing. If that is not what you came for, no hard feelings at all. Step away and find what nourishes you. But if you are staying, I am glad you are here.